I don't know. I think it's always hard to know why you're drawn to a particular thing. I think part of it is if you have a facility with that thing, then of course it's satisfying to do it, and so in a way that's self-reinforcing. And certainly I always had a facility with computers. I always got along well with them, and it was they're such extraordinary tools. I mean, you can teach them to do things, and then they actually do them. I mean, it's a kind of an incredible tool that we've built here in the 20th century. And that was a love affair that really did start in fourth grade. And then by the time I got to high school, I think when I was in 11th grade, I got an Apple II Plus, and continued fooling around with computers. And then by the time I got to Princeton, I was taking all the computer classes, and actually not just learning how to hack, but learning about algorithms and some of the mathematics behind computer science. And it's fascinating. I mean, it's really a very involving and fun subject. I toyed with the idea of starting a company, and even talked to a couple of friends about starting a company, and ultimately decided that it would be smarter to wait and learn a little bit more about business and the way the world works. One of the things that it's very hard to believe when you're 22 or 23 years old is that you don't already know everything. It turns out, I mean, as I suspect, people learn more and more as they get older, that you seem to realize that you know less and less every year that goes by. I can only imagine that by the time I'm 70, I will realize I know nothing. So that was, I think, a very good decision to not do that. I went to work for a startup company, but one in New York City that was building a network for helping brokerage firms clear trades. I mean, it's a kind of an obscure thing, and it's not very interesting to go into, but it used my technical skills, and it was very fun work, and I loved the people I was working with. And then from then on, I started working sort of at the intersection of computers and finance, and stayed on Wall Street for a long time. Ultimately worked for a company that did this thing called quantitative hedge fund trading. So what we did is we programmed the computers, and then the computers made stock trades. And that was very interesting too. And that was where I was working when I came across the fact that the web was growing at 2,300% a year, and that's what led to the forming of Amazon.com. So you want to start a company. Well, the first thing you do is you should write a business plan. And so I did that. I wrote about a 30-page business plan. I wrote a first draft. In fact, I wrote the first draft on the car trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that was that is very helpful. Now, the business plan won't survive its first encounters with reality. It will always be different. The reality will never be the plan. But the discipline of writing the plan forces you to think through some of the issues and to get sort of mentally comfortable in the space. I mean, then you start to understand, if you push on this knob, this will move over here, and so on. And so that's the first step. Once you are looking at the odds in a realistic way, it's very important for entrepreneurs to be realistic. And so if you believe on that first day while you're writing the business plan that there's a 70% chance that the whole thing will fail, and then that kind of relieves the pressure of self-doubt. I mean, it's sort of like, I don't have any doubt about whether we're going to fail. That's the likely outcome. And it just is, and to pretend that it's not will lead you to do strange and unnatural things. So and what you do with those early investment dollars, so if you have $300,000 and then you have $1 million, what you do with those early precious capital resources is you go about systematically trying to eliminate risk. So you pick whatever you think the biggest problems are, and you try to eliminate them one at a time. And that's how small companies get a little bit bigger and then a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger until finally, at a certain stage, you reach a transition where where the company has more control over its future destiny. The first sort of initial startup capital for Amazon.com came primarily from my parents, and they invested a large fraction of their life savings in what became Amazon.com. And that is was a very bold and trusting thing for them to do, because they didn't. My dad's first question was, "What's the internet?" Okay, so he wasn't making a bet on this company or this concept. He was making a bet on his son, as was my mother. So, and I told them that I thought there was a 70% chance that they would lose their whole investment, which was a few $100,000, and they did it anyway. And I thought I was giving myself triple the normal odds, because there's really if you look at the odds of a startup company succeeding at all, it's only about 10%. Here I was giving myself a 30% chance. I went to my boss and said to him, I'm going to go do this crazy thing, and I'm going to start this company selling books online. And this is something that I had already been talking to him about in a sort of more general context. But then he said, let's go on a walk. And we went on a 2-hour walk in Central Park in New York City. And the conclusion of that was he said, this actually sounds like a really good idea to me. But it sounds like it would be a better idea for somebody who didn't already have a good job. And he convinced me to think about it for 48 hours before making a final decision. And so I went away and was trying to find the right framework in which to make that kind of big decision. And I'd already talked to my wife about this, and she was very supportive and said, look, you can count me in 100%. Whatever you want to do. It's true. She had married this kind of, fairly stable guy in a stable career path, and now he wanted to go do this crazy thing, but she was 100% supportive. So it really was a decision that I had to make for myself. And the framework I found, which made the decision incredibly easy, was what I called, which only a nerd would call, a regret minimization framework. So I wanted to project myself forward to age 80 and say, okay, now I'm looking back on my life. I want to have minimized the number of regrets I have. And I knew that when I was 80, I was not going to regret having tried this. I was not going to regret having trying to participate in this thing called the internet that I thought was going to be a really big deal. I knew that if I failed, I wouldn't regret that. But I knew the one thing I might regret is not ever having tried. And I knew that that would haunt me every day. And so when I thought about it that way, it was an incredibly easy decision. And I think that's a very good, it's if you can project yourself out to age 80 and sort of think, what will I think at that time? It gets you away from some of the daily pieces of confusion. I left this Wall Street firm in the middle of the year. When you do that, you walk away from your annual bonus. And that's the kind of thing then the short term can confuse you. But if you think about the long term, then you can really make good life decisions that you won't regret later. I remember in 4th grade we had this wonderful contest, which was, the people in the class, whoever, there was some prize, I can't remember what it was, whoever could read the most Newbery Award winners in a year. And I read through, I didn't end up winning. I think I read like 30 Newbery Award winners that year, but somebody else read more. And the standout there is the old classic that I think so many people have read and enjoyed, A Wrinkle in Time. And I just remember loving that book. Later, I was always a big fan of science fiction, even from when I was, in elementary school, reading various things, and loved, of course, The Hobbit in Tolkien's trilogy that follows on from that. And this little town where my grandfather lived in the summers, where I spent my time in the summer, had a tiny little Andrew Carnegie style library where all the books had been donated from the local citizens. And I found, this is a very small library, smaller than the room that we're sitting in now, and it had, but it had an extensive science fiction collection, because it just so happened one of the residents of this 3,000 person town had been a science fiction fan and donated their whole collection. And that started a love affair for me with people like Heinlein and Asimov and all the well-known science fiction authors that persist to this day. If you look over long periods of time, look over hundreds of years, and look at the average sort of life cycle of a new technology, what you find is that it's getting compressed and compressed and compressed. So the rate of change is getting faster and faster. Every decade that goes by, there are sort of more important discoveries per unit time than there were in the previous decade. And a lot of these discoveries tend to have two uses. Technologies tend to be agnostic with respect to whether they can be used for good or used for evil. And I think that over the next 50 years, we are going to face a lot of very tough decisions as a society in how we make sure that we are harnessing those technologies for good purposes. The stress primarily comes from not taking action over something that you can have some control over. So if I find that some particular thing is causing me to have stress, that's a warning flag for me. What it means is there's something that I haven't completely identified, perhaps in my conscious mind, that is bothering me, and I haven't yet taken any action on it. I find as soon as I identify it and make the first phone call or send off the first email message or whatever it is that we're going to do to start to address that situation, even if it's not solved, the mere fact that we're addressing it dramatically reduces any stress that might come from it. So stress comes from ignoring things that you shouldn't be ignoring, I think, in large part. So stress doesn't come. People get stress wrong all the time, in my opinion. Stress doesn't come from hard work, for example. You can be working incredibly hard and loving it. And likewise, you can be out of work and incredibly stressed over that. So, and likewise, if you kind of use that as an analogy for what I was just talking about, if you're out of work, but you're going through, a disciplined approach of, a series of job interviews and so on and working to remedy that situation, you're going to be a lot less stressed than if you're just worrying about it and doing nothing. I think one thing I find very motivating, and and I think this is probably a very common form of motivation or motive or cause of motivation, is I love people counting on me. And so, today it's so easy to be motivated because we have millions of customers counting on us at Amazon.com. We've got thousands of investors counting on us, and we've got we're a team of thousands of employees all counting on each other, and so it's and that's fun. I think people should carefully reread the first part of the Declaration of Independence, because I think sometimes we as a society start to get confused and think that we have a right to happiness. But if you read the Declaration of Independence, it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nobody has a right to happiness. You should have a right to pursue it, and I think the core of that is liberty. We all get to decide, how we're going to go about making our own living and so on and so on. That happens to also be a very effective way of deploying an economy, so that you get an economy which mostly makes sense. Things mysteriously, because of that invisible hand, tend to work out. I remember there was a time, I may have these statistics slightly wrong, a few years ago, there was a heat wave in the South that killed 3% of chickens. And I think egg prices doubled because there were 3% fewer chickens. So that means that the number of chickens is roughly right, even though there's nobody deciding how many chickens there should be. All right, so that is a very interesting fact, I think, that the free market economy, which by necessity involves a lot of liberty, just happens to work well in terms of allocating resources. But imagine a different world. Imagine a world where some incredibly artificially intelligent computer could actually do a better job than the invisible hand of allocating resources, and were to say, there shouldn't be this many chickens, there should be this many chickens, just a few more or a few less. Well, that might even lead to more aggregate wealth. So it might be a society that if you give up liberty, everybody could be a little wealthier. Now, the question that I would pose is, if that turned out to be the world, is that a good trade? Personally, I don't think so. Personally, I think it'd be a terrible trade. And I sometimes worry about that, because I think it's a coincidence that that liberty tends to do such a good job of sort of creating an economy that functions well.